Hello, my name is Daniel Marino, and this is Karate Thoughts. So, I have been a karate practitioner since I was a child. I also have been a karate teacher now for my entire adult life. And this is just a weekly series where I take questions in the comment sections of each video and I try to answer them each week. So, we didn't get any good questions for a video last week, so I'm just going to talk about a topic that I think is interesting, I think is worth considering for the karate community at large. And it has to do with, some speculation and looking at the historical record for what information we can find about what kind of sparring used to be original to the art. So it's worth noting that when karate spread through mainland Japan in the early 1900s, sparring generally was not included in the training methodology. When you watch films from that time, when you look at the books from that time, it seemed like the training mostly had to do with kata or hyung forms, whatever you call them, conditioning, stuff like hitting the makiwara, stuff like that, partner drills, like one steps, like prearranged sparring. But what seemed to have been missing from the training was free sparring. And a lot of the prominent practitioners at the time, chief among them being Gichin Funakoshi, the founder of Shotokan, he actually was very much against the idea of creating any kind of like sport of karate, having any kind of free sparring. And this is just my impression of the history, anybody with specific knowledge in this area, please leave a comment and contribute to the conversation. But a lot of the young men in the Japanese universities, they're training karate primarily through the university system. They started creating their own free sparring. That kind of became what we know of as point fighting today. The first championship in Japan was actually held, the year after Funakoshi died, and I don't think that was a coincidence. But I was reading an article just the other day from a blog run by Motobu Naoki, and he's Motobu Choki's grandson, and he has a really good blog on medium.com. I would really suggest following it if you're interested in the history. He's just all the articles that he published, and he posts very frequently, but the articles always have a lot of really interesting information to consider. But just a little quote from an article he published an English translation of, at least, just the other day. I think the original article is from a few years ago, but just recently published an English translation. He said, the kumite match in the form of Kikii was called kakedemeshi. The true meaning of these techniques and match format was rapidly lost after karate was adopted by the middle school and Okinawan normal school. This may have led to the loss of the miyotode technique as well. The title of the article was Miyotode, or Husband and Wife Hands, and again, you can find it on medium.com. And he was just talking about, I've seen this position, it's kind of a concept in Okinawan karate or karate in general of using both hands together when you fight, and I think it sometimes also refers specifically to this position that's found in a lot in the various kata. And you can see there's some exercises found in some styles of karate they refer to as kakiri, which is about like sticky hands, where you stick to each other and you do different exercises that manipulate body weight or control the limbs. And the theory seems to be that like those drills are a remnant of an older form of sparring that existed, where you would start forearm to forearm and it would be very close range and would maintain contact. Now, I share a lot of clinch sparring on this channel and in various places where I post online, and I don't really claim it to be authentic or original. It's kind of the way that I learned it. I got started with it a lot from the training that I've done with Ian Abernethy, who also he calls it kata-based sparring, but he was the one who introduced me to clinch sparring, but I've integrated it for a while now into my own practice, into my own teaching. And it's kind of just how I make sense of what I see in the traditional karate forms. I don't claim it to be something original or authentic, because I just have no way really of knowing that. I don't know if the clinch sparring that I share is something close maybe to what sparring used to originally be like in karate. It's my best guess, though. You know, I just wouldn't rule out the possibility. I just wouldn't make a claim like that. But anyway, I want to kind of refer to here, this idea that he brings up in this quote, where he says that the true meaning of these techniques and match format, specifically talking about the match format here, was rapidly lost after karate was adopted in the middle school and Okinawan normal school. So to me, this is like the big mystery of karate, which is that, you know, whatever this original like sparring format was, which I kind of assumed to be the basis of the art. I assumed that, like all martial arts, it was based on combat at some level. And they had to have a way of practicing this combat in a free-form way with, you know, with intelligent, genuine resistance. There had to have been some kind of sparring for it to be a functional martial art. And it might be worth considering that karate was never a functional martial art. Again, that's not really a thing that's not a question I really can answer. But just working from the assumption that there was some kind of sparring, and we do seem to have some scattered references here and there in the writings that we have to something, you know, they call it kakademeshi. There's a martial artist from Brazil named Bruno Chagas who wrote a very good article about this a few years ago, where he kind of compiled a lot of the references that we have to this practice of kakademeshi into one place. So he calls his page Puro Karate, and I would really suggest checking him out and checking out that article specifically. He's done some good research on this topic. But, you know, just assuming that there was some kind of sparring that was original to the art, the big mystery to me is how it could be lost so completely in like a generation, you know? And I'm going to give you my best explanation that I can think of for this, and that, you know, it's important to remember there, and I have them written down here, there's some historical dates where the Ryukyuan Kingdom was abolished in 1987, and that was when the modern Okinawan prefecture was founded, you know, which is the modern, a part of the modern Japanese state. Prior to that, it was the Ryukyuan Kingdom, and they had a caste system, and it was, you know, a very different society. But once the kingdom was abolished and it became a part of the modern Japanese state, the nobility in Okinawa, who were the ones who practiced karate, you know, almost everyone practicing karate back then, to my knowledge, would have been of the noble class. Well, these people, you know, certainly some of them would have become, their lives would have changed drastically with this, because it's no longer a, you know, traditional caste system, at least in theory. You know, I guess in theory they were all just citizens of the Japanese state now. So it really resulted in a loss of, at least in a formal sense, this would have resulted in a loss of formal social standing for the noble class. And these were the karate practitioners. They're men of the noble class for the most part. So this changed Okinawan society significantly. You know, a lot of people of this noble class that would have worked in the government, like Itosu, Uncle Itosu, the, you know, first person to teach karate in the Okinawan school systems. He did that in 1905. You know, he would have been one of those people who, with the abolishment of the Ryukyuan Kingdom, you know, he was employed directly by the king. You know, he worked in the previous government. So anyone that, you know, worked for the government in the Ryukyuan Kingdom were essentially replaced by this new government that was put in place by the modern Japanese state. And again, this is not history that I'm super familiar with, so please, if somebody in the comments has a different perspective they'd like to share, please, you know, leave a comment. I'd love to engage with you about it. But this is my understanding of the history. So you had this major event, which was that in 1879, the Ryukyuan Kingdom was abolished, right? So most of the karate practitioners, you know, being of the noble class, their lives would have changed significantly from this event. and many of them would have had to have found a new way to make a living. And in my opinion, this explains the creation of modern karate, specifically through a man like Itosu. You know, he started teaching karate in the Okinawan school systems, and based on what many people have said about this karate, is that this karate that he created in that school system was very different from what came before it, and it became very widespread. So whatever the original art was like prior to, you know, the modern Okinawan prefecture being established, you know, in the Ryukyuan Kingdom, it was a martial art that was practiced by a small number of people of the noble class. There was this time period, right, where the kingdom was abolished in 1879, and then it wasn't until 1905 that Itosu started teaching karate in the Okinawan school systems. And then this version of karate would have been much more widespread, right, because he was taking whole classes of young people and they were learning karate there. And this was the kind of karate that really spread across the world. So whatever the art was like, you know, Itosu really very much was a turning point in karate's history, as far as I understand it. You know, whatever, for the subject of this video, with it being about sparring specifically, it's also worth noting that I believe it's 1908 it was published. There was a teacher's manual from the school systems published by Chomo Hanashiro, who was a student of Itosu's, describing what seems like the earliest references we can find to one-steps, right? Where, you know, like preset partner exercises where one person will do an attack and the other person will have a predetermined, you know, response that they'll drill to it. It's my opinion that these one-steps really replaced whatever sparring existed into the art prior to this. Maybe call it kakedemeshi. That's what that term is referring to. And it would make sense, right? You know, Itosu and his students were teaching karate to large groups of young people, you know, in a formal institutional setting. Sparring was probably seen as something that was more dangerous. It's where there was more risk of injury. It's also more functional training. So, you know, these youngsters, instead of just strengthening their bodies and teaching them discipline, making them athletes, you know, it would give them real functional fighting ability, which maybe could be misused. Maybe that's a reason why the sparring wasn't incorporated. But anyway, you know, I still find it a bit of a mystery, though, that if there was a sparring method that was so widespread, that it would be lost so completely. You know, you do have some exceptions to this. A guy like the books of Motobu Choki, for instance, you know, his first book was on sparring. But even the sparring that he shows there, although it is a little bit different in many ways than what many of his contemporaries were doing, I still would describe what he shows in that book essentially looking to be like one-steps. You know, it was prearranged kumite. You know, it wasn't free sparring that Motobu was showing there. I don't know of any, you know, there are references, of course, to Motobu being a fighter, to have engaged in a lot of fights and a lot of kakedemeshi type matches. You know, there's even a story about him and Funakoshi having a match like that. So it seems to me, though, as far as I can make sense of the history here, that there was this older style of sparring, and we're not even really able to say much definitively about it, because there's no photographs and there's no, much less videos that we can see of people engaging in it, that existed in the original art. It wasn't included in the version of the art that Itosu and his students created to teach in the Okinawan school systems. And then that is the style of karate that became far more widespread. It was practiced by so many more people than the original art. And so when karate spread overseas to mainland Japan, the art became very much dominated by this version of it that was really Itosu's legacy. People like Motobu Choki, looking at the books that he wrote in the 1920s and the 1930s, are really interesting, because it seems like he's, you know, kind of a throwback to what the older training might have been like. But you have to remember that when he was writing those books, you know, his first book I think was published in 1926. I mean, you know, the Ryukyuan Kingdom was abolished decades before that. You know, Motobu would have been in his 50s when he wrote that book. You know, so he was recalling something that was from decades before, and he was writing for a karate audience that had learned this version of the art that was very much dominated by the work of Itosu and his students, like Funakoshi being prime among them. So I hope that wasn't too scattered. I hope you guys could follow my train of thought there, but I just think it's it's a very, very fascinating part of karate history to delve into, considering what sparring, you know, practices, if any, used to be prevalent, and were original to the art, and therefore would explain what we see in the traditional kata and the traditional forms a lot better. The clinch sparring that I share is kind of a modern recreation. I don't claim it to be something that was like what was practiced in the past, just because I have no way of really knowing that. But for me, it's something that I love doing. I appreciate, because I think it makes me a better martial artist, makes my students a better martial artist, it makes us better prepared to fight and defend ourselves. It's also something that I can connect much more logically to what I see in many in the movements of the traditional forms. So I'm a really big advocate for this kind of practice. I would really suggest that more karate people look into it, more pro karate people start integrating it into their practice, because I think it would really it would put the art in a much better place. So anyway, thank you very much for listening, and I'll look forward to coming back with next week's video.